I want you to picture a painting, right? It's highly stylized and just incredibly detailed.
Oh, absolutely. The detail is usually the first thing that grabs you.
Yeah, and this specific one originates from 15th century Herat, which is in modern-day Afghanistan. It's titled Humayun in a Garden, and it depicts this Persian prince meeting a Chinese princess.
Right, a very classic motif.
But if you look closely at it, there is this totally bizarre detail that just defies logic. I mean, it is explicitly a night scene. There's a moon, there are stars painted in the sky.
Yeah, the celestial elements are very clear.
Right. But the anonymous artist painted the whole scene as if every single person in that garden possesses, like, perfect night vision.
It is a really striking artistic choice. I mean, everything is illuminated. The colors are super vivid.
Yeah.
The plants, the architecture, the people, they are all totally conventionalized and ravishingly decorative. There is literally not a single shadow cast in the entire frame.
And that choice is just fascinating because, you know, if you look at what Western artists were doing at the exact same time, painters like Piero del Francesca, they were agonizing over shadows.
Oh, they were obsessed with them.
Completely obsessed. They were trying to capture precisely how candlelight behaves in a dark tent, or, you know, how colors fade into the gloom of night. The West basically wanted this gritty, realistic window into the world.
Right, a totally different visual philosophy.
Exactly. But this Persian miniaturist just completely ignored the physical reality of darkness, choosing instead to paint this idealized, shadowless paradise. And as we're going to see today, when a culture decides to entirely ignore the shadows, it eventually develops a pretty catastrophic blind spot.
It really does. And that deliberate choice, not to reproduce the real world, tells us an enormous amount about the civilization that actually produced it.
For sure.
That art was designed for an aristocratic clientele who wanted their world to reflect an ideal, tranquil order. You know, a place where messy realities and external threats were just concealed by a strict, unchanging code of conduct.
Which brings us to our mission for today. Welcome to The Deep Dive. I'm your host, and today we are using an incredibly insightful introduction by historian Robert Irwin from the New Cambridge History of Islam to just break down the vast, complex family of Islamic civilization.
And it is a massive family to cover.
It really is. We're going to show you how this culture built one of the most astonishing golden ages in human history by basically absorbing everything in its path.
Yeah, the synthesis is incredible.
Right. And, more importantly, we are going to explore the mechanisms of how a civilization can become so successful and so entirely self-sufficient that it effectively traps itself in the past. Okay, let's unpack this. Because even using a phrase like Islamic art to classify that painting of the prince and princess is, well, it's technically inaccurate, right?
It is notoriously difficult to categorize, yeah. If you examine that painting Humayun, the subject matter isn't strictly religious at all.
Right, it's just a romance.
Exactly. It illustrates a princely romance, and it prominently features human figures, which technically violates the traditional prohibition against fashioning images. So calling it Islamic art is really just a term of convenience for Western historians who crave, you know, neat little categories.
Yeah, Irwin points out that if you try to find a single definitive thread connecting, say, a 15th century Persian painting, an 8th century Umayyad desert palace, and a mosque in Indonesia, you will just drive yourself crazy.
You really will.
There is no single trait.
Precisely. To understand how this works, we really have to borrow a concept from the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein.
Okay, lay it on me.
So when Wittgenstein tried to define the word game, he realized there wasn't one single feature that board games, card games, and athletic sports all shared.
Right, because chess and football don't have much in common physically.
Exactly. Instead, he saw this complex network of overlapping similarities. He called these family resemblances.
So for you listening, it really helps to stop thinking of one monolithic Islamic civilization and start viewing it as a massive family of different cultures spanning centuries and continents. And they're all just sharing these subtle resemblances.
Right, and those resemblances aren't always religious, which is key. Take literature, for example. The qasida, which is a very specific verse form, is common to almost all Islamic literatures.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, whether it's written in Arabic, Persian, Turkish, or even Swahili. But the structure of the qasida has literally nothing to do with religious scripture.
It's just a cultural export.
Basically, yeah. Or look at the visual arts. You have the intricate honeycomb-like architectural carvings called muqarnas. You see them from Andalusia in Spain all the way to Sumatra.
They are just the aesthetic DNA of this cultural family. But here is the part that demands a closer look, I think. So much of this foundational DNA was actually imported.
Yes, heavily imported.
We already mentioned the Chinese princess in the painting, but the influence of China on the visual arts and technology of the Islamic world was profound. Like that floral chinoiserie motif totally dominated the aesthetics of Turkey, India, and Iran.
It really did. And the Greek influence was arguably even more structural than that. I mean, Islamic architecture was the direct heir to the Hellenistic world.
Oh, really? How so?
Well, you know the famous arabesque design?
Yeah, the interlacing geometric patterns. They seem so quintessentially Islamic.
Right, but that actually evolved directly from the earlier Greek use of vine leaf motifs in their stonework.
That is wild. I look at this era and it just feels like the ultimate remix culture. Like they were treating global history like open source software, you know?
It's the great way to put it.
Yeah, they're pulling the best structural code from the Greeks, taking visual rendering engines from the Chinese, borrowing narrative frameworks from the Persians, and just compiling it all into a totally new operating system.
What's fascinating here is that much of what we recognize today as the core of Islamic culture derived from local, pre-existing, and decidedly non-Islamic histories, rather than being strictly imposed by Arab conquerors.
Huh.
Yeah, the early Muslims were heirs to overlapping, competing versions of the past, and they actively synthesized them. Take their approach to classical antiquity, for instance. Alexander the Great and his tutor, Aristotle, figured prominently in Arabic literature, but they were completely reimagined in Muslim garb.
Right, and they weren't just reading Aristotle's actual treatises on logic, were they?
Not exactly, no.
They were obsessed with a completely bogus, pseudo-Aristotelian text called The Secret of Secrets, which is just hilarious to me. It was essentially a medieval manual for statecraft and occultism masquerading as Greek philosophy.
Exactly. It was wildly popular, though. It provided a really practical, albeit folkloristic, guide for princes.
But if we follow this open source software analogy, I mean, if you just blindly compile Greek philosophy, Chinese aesthetics, and Persian mythology into one system, your operating system is going to crash.
It's definitely a risk.
Right, it's too contradictory. Which brings us to the pre-Islamic ghosts. They basically led into the machine. They didn't just borrow art, they integrated the core values of the people they lived alongside.
They absolutely did. A cultured Muslim leader was expected to be deeply familiar with the poetry and stories of the pre-Islamic Arabs of the peninsula.
So they were holding on to these older ideas.
Very much so.
Yeah.
They clung to ancient pagan Arab values. Concepts like sabr, which means endurance or patience, and muruwa, which translates to a highly specific kind of chivalric manliness.
Okay.
These were ideals forged in the unforgiving environment of the desert long before the Prophet, yet they were proudly espoused by much later deeply devout Muslim warlords, including the famous Saladin.
And it wasn't just the Arabs either. The Iranian legacy was monumental. In the early 11th century, the poet Ferdowsi wrote the Shahnameh, which is this epic Persian poem that basically stitched together all these pre-Islamic Iranian legends to celebrate a distinct Iranian identity.
Right.
And it became the ultimate guidebook for how a prince should behave.
But it did. It was incredibly influential. But perhaps the most jarring adoption of an external code of conduct came from the East.
Oh, this is the part that just blew my mind.
Yeah, so in the 13th century, the Mongols swept through, establishing an empire that stretched from China to the Euphrates, devastating the older Islamic political centers.
Just total destruction.
Yes. And in the aftermath of that trauma, many people in regions like Iran who describe themselves as Muslims began to adopt the traditional practices of Genghis Khan.
Okay, wait, so if you're a devout Muslim leader in the 13th century, you might also be taking life advice from the legendary pagan warlord who just conquered your ancestors. How does that work? The logical gymnastics there seem totally impossible.
I know, it sounds bizarre, but it requires an incredibly pragmatic approach to statecraft. You have to understand that the Mongols, having conquered the known world, possessed the ultimate military and political prestige.
Okay, so it's about power.
Exactly. So for a ruler operating in that geographic space post-conquest, integrating the Yasa, which is the Mongol code of law, wasn't necessarily framed as abandoning Islam. They compartmentalized it.
Interesting.
Yeah, they viewed it as a Chinggisid Sunnah, or customary practice that was just necessary for survival. Religion governed the soul and the mosque, but the Mongol code governed the battlefield and the state apparatus.
But that compartmentalization is exactly why I ask how the system didn't just crash. You have a society running Greek philosophy, pre-Islamic Arab manliness, Persian epics, and Mongol statecrafts.
It's a lot to juggle.
It's a ton. What was the kernel? What was the core programming that kept this civilization unified and prevented it from fracturing into 100 different cultural splinter groups?
The kernel was the orthodox religious core and the institutions meticulously built to defend it. Despite all these secular mysteries floating around, the absolute foundational ideal of life was provided by the Prophet Muhammad and his immediate family.
So that was the anchor.
Yes. The historical narrative of the early Islamic conquests gave the community its unified identity.
And this wasn't just a vague spiritual feeling, right? It was a highly codified system managed by religious scholars, the ulama. They anchored the society in the Quran and the Hadith, which are the orally transmitted reports of the Prophet's sayings and actions.
Precisely. This established the Sunnah, the law, and code of conduct based on precedent. Now, it is important to note the differing approaches here.
Right, between Sunni and Shia.
Yes, the Sunni tradition relied heavily on community consensus to interpret these laws. The Shia communities, however, transmitted different traditions focusing on the imams descended from the Prophet's family, and they placed a much greater emphasis on the power of mujtahids.
Which are scholars exercising independent judgment, right?
Exactly, scholars who had the right to exercise independent, rational judgment.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because whether Sunni or Shia, this intense drive to figure out how ancient laws applied to a rapidly expanding, highly complex empire led to profound intellectual ferment.
Oh, absolutely.
It sparked what is arguably the golden age of Arab intellectual culture, roughly between the years 950 and 1050.
It was an era of unprecedented intellectual production. You had polymaths like the philosopher Ibn Sina, the geographer al-Biruni, and the optic scientist Ibn al-Haytham.
Just brilliant minds.
Truly. Philosophy, exact sciences, mathematics, and even secular poetry all just flourished side by side.
And we really have to talk about the physical mechanism that made this golden age possible.
Yeah.
It wasn't just that people suddenly became smarter overnight. It was an economic shift driven by a new technology.
Paper. Yes, the adoption of paper from the East fundamentally altered the intellectual landscape.
Right, because before paper, you were writing on parchment, which is basically animal skin.
Which is incredibly tedious to make.
And so expensive. If you want to write a complex philosophical treatise, it might cost a fortune just in raw materials alone. But paper is exponentially cheaper. It democratized the physical transmission of ideas.
It completely changed the game.
Yeah. A mathematician in Cordoba could write a theorem, and because paper was cheap and lightweight, it could be copied and transported to Baghdad or Cairo in a matter of months. Paper allowed complex arguments to scale.
Exactly. It sustained not just literature, but complex commerce, banking, and state administration. But, as you might expect, this explosion of free thinking, fueled by cheap paper and Greek philosophy, deeply threatened the orthodox religious elites.
Oh, they must have hated it.
They did. They needed a mechanism to reassert control over the intellectual landscape, and their solution was a brilliant institutional invention, the madrasa.
This part blew my mind. When I was reading this, my perspective completely flipped. The madrasa, which originated in 10th century Khorasan, looks at first glance like a benign medieval university for teaching theology.
It does seem that way.
But these were not centers for the disinterested, neutral pursuit of knowledge. They were state-sponsored ideological weapons.
They were highly strategic. The rulers realized that if you control the educational curriculum, you control the bureaucratic class. For example, in Cairo, the Fatimid Caliph, representing a minority Shia regime, founded the House of Knowledge.
Right.
It attracted scholars from all over, but its primary structural purpose was Ismaili Shia indoctrination. They were intentionally training a loyal administrative class.
It's basically a medieval think tank designed to corner the market on government jobs. And it worked both ways, too. When Saladin, who was a Sunni Muslim, overthrew the Fatimids in Egypt, he didn't just win on the battlefield.
No, he fought an intellectual war, too.
Yeah, he systematically founded a network of Sunni madrasas. By ensuring that only Sunni-educated scholars could get jobs as judges, administrators, and teachers, he choked off the political oxygen for the Shia factions. He essentially used education for the intellectual recolonization of the region.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the standardization of these madrasas, along with a shared code of law, the Sharia, created an incredibly cohesive internal ecosystem. It meant that a scholar could travel thousands of miles and step into a completely familiar administrative environment.
Which perfectly explains Ibn Battuta, the famous 14th century traveler. For you listening, imagine traveling from West Africa to the Middle East, all the way to the Maldives, and finding the exact same institutional setup everywhere you go.
Yes, it's pretty remarkable. Wherever Ibn Battuta went, he found the mosque, the public bathhouse, the market, and the madrasa. Because of this shared educational and legal curriculum, brilliant minds could easily find employment as judges or administrators in lands entirely distant from their place of birth. The civilization had basically become a massive, self-sustaining loop.
But causality is a double-edged sword, because that incredible cohesive success is exactly what caused them to close themselves off.
That's the tragedy of it.
Yeah. As we look at the later centuries, from the 13th to the 18th centuries, we had to look at who was actually running this perfectly insulated ecosystem. And it is one of the most counterintuitive political structures in history. The governing elite, the people driving the culture and the military, were very often educated slaves.
It is a profound paradox to modern sensibilities, for sure. The governing and military classes in much of the Islamic heartlands drew heavily on men of slave origin.
It's just wild to think about.
Yeah, the Mamluk regime in Egypt and Syria constantly renewed itself by importing military slaves from the Russian steppes and the Caucasus. The Ottoman Empire utilized the Devsirmeye levy, where young Christian boys from the Balkans were taken, converted to Islam, and rigorously trained for the elite administration and military.
Wow.
The Safavid Shahs in Iran did the exact same thing with Georgians and Armenians.
Okay, explain the why here. Why would the most powerful empires on Earth deliberately hand the keys to their military and bureaucracy to people they enslaved from foreign lands?
Because it solved the greatest threat to any monarch, aristocratic dynasties.
Ah, right, internal rivals.
Exactly. If you rely on local noble families to run your army, eventually those families build their own power bases and try to overthrow you. But a young boy taken from the Russian steppes has no local family ties in Cairo.
No cousins to scheme with.
Right, his entire identity, his wealth, and his status are entirely dependent on the Sultan. It is a ruthless but highly effective mechanism to ensure absolute loyalty to the state.
And these slave elites weren't just the muscle, right? They were highly educated administrators and patrons of the arts. The source material mentions Sinan, who came through that Ottoman Devsirmeye slave levy as a janissary engineer and eventually became one of the greatest master architects in world history, designing some of Istanbul's most iconic mosques.
They were the engine of a culture that had become spectacularly successful. And as a result of that success, it became deeply, thoroughly self-sufficient. They literally had everything they needed within their own border.
The economic insulation is just staggering. In the late 17th century, a French jeweler named Jean Chardin visited Isfahan in Persia. He basically created a 17th century spreadsheet comparing Persian craftsmanship to European manufacturing.
And his findings were very clear. Chardin admitted the Persians were vastly superior in textiles, wirework, metalwork, dyeing, tailoring, and even the manufacture of fireworks.
That's a lot of industries.
Yeah. The list of things where they lagged behind Europe was incredibly short, mostly limited to glass, paper, and bookbinding.
Economically, they genuinely didn't need Europe. Even by the late 18th century, only 14.6% of the Ottoman province of Egypt's trade was with Europe. The overwhelming majority of their commerce was internal or pointing eastward, and culturally, they exhibited the exact same self-sufficiency.
There is a really telling observation from a Frenchman named Antoine Galland in 1697. He was baffled as to why Eastern scholars took absolutely no interest in Western literature or philosophy.
You just didn't care.
Not at all. His conclusion was simple. Their own internal literature, history, and theology was so staggeringly rich that they felt absolutely no need to look beyond their own borders.
But that richness became their trap. Because they had this vast, successful history, their entire worldview became retrospective. If a ruler or a scholar faced a novel problem in the present, they didn't run an experiment to find a new solution.
No, they look backward.
Yeah, they looked to the sacred past, to the blueprint laid out by the prophet, the early conquests, and the ancient scholars, just assuming the answer was already there.
And while that retrospective focus provided incredible social stability for centuries, it fostered a deep systemic reluctance to innovate. By the year 1800, the Islamic world was still effectively self-sufficient on paper, but underneath it was profoundly weak in relation to a West that had spent the last 2 centuries fully embracing the scientific method and rapid industrialization.
So what does this all mean? How does a civilization that literally gave us the golden age of science, that translated Greek logic and invented algebra, suddenly find itself completely outmatched?
This raises an important question about the delicate balance any society must strike between revering its heritage and embracing the unknown. When an entire culture believes its past contains all the necessary answers, they stop asking new questions.
They stop looking.
Right. They stop looking into the shadows and they become deeply vulnerable to those who are constantly innovating.
And for this culture, the breaking point arrived pretty violently. Napoleon Bonaparte lands in Egypt in the 1790s.
Yes, and the reaction of the Egyptian chronicler Al-Jabarti perfectly encapsulates this tragic clash of paradigms. When the French first arrived and began launching hot air balloons over Cairo, Al-Jabarti affected to be amused. He basically dismissed the balloons as mere toys for children.
It's the ultimate defense mechanism. Like, we don't need your novelties. We have our traditions.
Exactly. But later, Al-Jabarti witnessed the actual scientific and chemical experiments conducted by Bonaparte's savants, and the reality of the technological gap finally registered.
The wake-up call.
A brutal one. He was forced to write, and I quote, "These are things which minds like ours cannot comprehend." In that single moment, centuries of magnificent, unquestioned self-sufficiency shattered into profound self-doubt.
It is a devastating historical realization. And for you listening, this isn't just an abstract history lesson about the 18th century. It is a masterclass in how the greatest strength of any organization, whether it's an empire, a modern corporation, or your own personal career, can become your most fatal blind spot.
That's a great point.
Because when you rely entirely on the blueprints that made you successful in the past, you lose the ability to perceive the threats and the opportunities brewing in the future.
The very institutions and self-sufficiency that protected them eventually walled them off from a changing reality.
If you are operating at the top of your field today, highly advanced and intellectually dominant, it is terrifyingly easy to fall into the trap of assuming you have nothing left to learn from the outside world, which leaves you with something to mull over today. What modern industries, or even nations, are currently living in their own comfortable, self-contained 18th century Ottoman bubble? Who out there is completely ignoring the shadows, blissfully unaware of the hot air balloons about to land in their backyard?
It's a question every successful organization should be asking themselves right now.
It truly is. It brings us right back to that 15th century Persian painting, the prince and the princess in the garden. The artist painted them with perfect night vision, living in a beautiful, shadowless paradise. It was a masterpiece of control and decorum. But outside the frame of that painting, the real world was full of shadows, and if you refuse to look into the dark, you won't see what's coming until it's too late.